Chapter 4: The Velvet Stranger. The bell above Madame Delacourt's door gave a crisp chime, sharp against the steady murmur of scissors and hushed conversations in the back workroom. Margaret didn't look up at first. She was focused on the delicate hem of a tea-length dress, her fingers nimbly guiding silk along the sewing machine's needle. She barely noticed when Madame's heels clicked briskly across the showroom floor to greet the visitors. But then she heard his voice. Deep, deliberate, with the subtle edge of practiced charm. A voice that didn't belong to their town's familiar rhythms. "I believe my fiancé has an appointment," the man said. Margaret's heart caught mid-beat. Something about the tone stirred an old memory, distant, blurred at the edges. She glanced up instinctively and saw him. Nicholas Scott. Of course, he was taller now, broader in the shoulders, his posture straight as a cut of fine wool. His hair was sun-touched and neatly combed back, his jaw more defined than she remembered, but the eyes were the same. Grey-green, like storm clouds over the river. The very eyes that once watched her thread needles during school picnics, smiling with secret amusement. And standing beside him, no, slightly in front of him, was the reason for his visit. The girl was beautiful in that effortless, glossy way of women who have never heard the word no. Light hair swept into soft waves, eyes like polished sapphires, a fur stole casually draped across narrow shoulders despite the warmth of the day. She wore a diamond ring that sparkled like frost on her delicate hand. "Miss Veronica Whitmore," Madame was saying, her voice richer now, and silk for clients with bank accounts to match. "Of course. We are honored." Veronica gave a smile as sharp as a folded fan. "I require my trousseau to be designed here." "Only here?" Margaret's hands felt heavy against the silk she was sewing. She hadn't meant to stare, but her gaze lingered an instant too long. Nicholas noticed. Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, the shop was silent. Margaret could not read his expression, surprise, perhaps, something else beneath it. Recognition came next, but not the warmth she had foolishly hoped for on quiet nights beneath her patchwork quilt. It was more like a polite curiosity, as if she were a face glimpsed at a train station long ago. He gave the smallest nod. Formal. Distant. As though acknowledging the presence of a shop girl and nothing more. Margaret lowered her gaze at once, throat tight. The sewing machine resumed its rhythm beneath her hand, but her heart was making a quieter, harder stitch of its own. "Of course, Miss Whitmore," Madame continued. "We will assign you our best seamstresses." Nicholas's glance slid away, already following the voice of his glittering bride-to-be. The echo of Veronica's laughter drifted like perfume in the air. Margaret did not look up again. But something inside her shifted, not like silk, but like steel being sharpened. This was no longer about velvet dreams or rose-hemmed sleeves. This was war, stitched one perfect seam at a time. Chapter 5: The Dressmaker's Sanctuary. Behind the polished brass letters of Madame, fine dressmaking and tailoring, behind the lace-curtained windows promising refinement and Parisian airs, there was a sanctuary. A world of cloth and thread, of whispered ambition stitched into silk. Margaret knew this room better than she knew the streets of her own town. It was not merely a workroom, it was a cathedral of fabric, where sunlight filtered through gauzy curtains like stained glass, painting the worn wooden floors in pale gold. The scent was always the same, a mingling of rosewater, starch, old paper, and a faint metallic tang from scissors left open on the table. The walls were lined with bolts of fabric arranged like treasured books. Satin in shades of ivory, blush, and deep garnet. Silk carmeuse so fluid it slipped through her fingers like water. Crisp taffeta in colors of ripe peach and burnished bronze. Soft, whispering muslin folded into neat stacks, waiting to become something finer than itself. And lace. Lace everywhere. French chantilly, with delicate floral motifs like frozen frost on glass. Italian guipure, heavy and sculpted like cathedral stonework. Brussels lace, sheer and ethereal, with edges that seemed to disappear against the skin. Margaret could never resist running her fingertips lightly along their scalloped hems, careful not to catch the threads. It was like touching clouds made of spun sugar. In narrow drawers along the side wall were spools of thread, arranged in careful gradients of color. Not just white, black, and navy, but thousands of shades in between, the palest shell pink, the soft gold of old wedding rings, stormy grey like distant rain. One drawer was devoted entirely to metallic threads, silver, bronze, and a single spool of fine gold reserved for the most extravagant commissions. A battered cardboard box sat beneath one work table, filled with buttons, mother of pearl, tiny glass orbs with hand-painted flowers, heavy brass discs embossed with family crests. When one rolled off the table and clattered to the floor, the soft echo would linger in the quiet like a distant bell. On the far wall, beneath a framed sketch of a Parisian ballroom gown, hung the tools of their trade. Scissors with blades sharp as razors. Measuring tapes curled like sleeping snakes. Chalk pencils in dusty tins, soft blue, pale lavender, and the faintest butter yellow. Patterns drawn on onion skin paper were stacked neatly on open shelves, their edges curling slightly from use. Every gown that emerged from this room carried the weight of dozens of choices, the right cut of neckline, the precise drape of fabric over the curve of a hip, the placement of a single pearl button that could change the balance of an entire bodice. It was beautiful. It was ruthless. Margaret moved through the room with reverence and longing tangled together. This was her world, and yet not fully hers. Not yet. One day, she thought. One day, my name will be stitched beneath a collar or hidden in the lining of a gown. Not as a seamstress, but as a designer. Margaret Grayson, the signature on silk, not the invisible hand behind the stitches. For now, she worked in quiet obedience, threading needles, pinning darts, measuring hems for women who did not know her name. But as she brushed her fingertips across a bolt of scarlet silk waiting for Veronica Whitmore's wedding gown, she made herself a silent promise. One day, she would not be sewing someone else's story. She would be making her own. Chapter 6: Threads and Silk Smiles. The days at Madame Delacourt's moved by the rhythm of stitches, like the ticking of some great, invisible clock. Morning light slanted through the lace curtains, catching on floating threads and motes of dust that drifted lazily in the warm air. The hum of the sewing machine became the pulse of Margaret's life. It was beautiful work, yes. But it was also endless. Margaret's world was measured in inches and pins, in careful darts sewn by hand, in seams so straight they could have been drawn with a ruler. Her fingers, pricked countless times by needles, carried the faintest callus now, though her nails were always clean and neat, never painted. And then, the girls would arrive. They came in groups of 2 or 3, sometimes with mothers trailing behind them like elegant shadows. Young women of wealth and softness, of perfume and gloves, of silk stockings and shoes with satin bows. They entered the salon as if it were a theatre made only for them. Some were polite, curious, smiling with gentle curiosity at the bolts of fabric spread before them. They asked questions about lace types, admired the delicate embroidery, listened to Madame Delacourt's measured suggestions with wide, eager eyes. But others were different. They walked with sharp heels and sharper words. Raised eyebrows, pursed lips, and impatient sighs when measurements took too long. They wanted more pearls, less lace, more drama, no, start again. Their voices sliced through the quiet of the workroom like glass breaking. One girl, not much older than Margaret, once wrinkled her nose at a gown Margaret had spent 3 days basting by hand. "It looks common," she had said with an elegant shudder, the pearls at her throat catching the light. "I want something grander." Margaret had only nodded. She had become very good at nodding. Good at folding her pride like spare fabric and tucking it away where no one would notice. But behind her calm expression, a quiet defiance burned. "You would be nothing without us," she thought sometimes. "Without the hands that sew the dreams you wear." And yet, there were moments of softness, too. Once, a shy girl named Rebecca chose a simple muslin dress with tiny hand-sewn roses along the collar and whispered to Margaret, "I'm nervous about the ball. I don't know how to dance." Margaret had smiled gently and offered a quiet, "The dress will make you brave." Not all of them were cruel. But wealth made kindness optional. By the time evening arrived, the beauty of the dresses blurred into exhaustion. Her back ached from leaning over cutting tables, her fingertips rough from hours spent pushing needles through dense seams. Even her breath seemed to hum in time with the stitching. Margaret's own clothes were practical but chosen with care, are plain, yes, but clean, pressed, with small, quiet details only a trained eye would notice. A modest navy skirt that fell just below the knee, a soft blouse with hand-stitched embroidery along the collar, stockings mended neatly at the toes, and sensible, polished black shoes. Around her waist, a thin leather belt with a small brass buckle, worn but elegant. Always a cardigan in soft greys or pale blues, sleeves pushed back while working. No jewels. No ribbons. Just thread, neatly wound around her fingers like invisible rings of her own making. When the final bell above the door chimed for closing, Margaret would gather her things in silence, her sewing kit, a folded muslin apron, the small tin of pins she never lent to anyone. Madame would not once, approving or disapproving depending on the mood of the day. Then Margaret would step out into the cool evening, the world outside smelling of cut grass and chimney smoke. The grand homes with their glowing windows belonged to others. She walked alone, head high, the hem of her skirt brushing lightly against her stockings as she moved down Elm Street. People might have called her plain, perhaps. But never careless. She was not one of them. Not yet. But one day the women who wrinkled their noses at her hems would wear gowns with her name stitched beneath the lining. Margaret didn't need silk gloves or velvet hats to prove herself. She only needed a needle. And time. Chapter 7. The gown that wasn't hers. The ballroom glowed like a gilded cage. Crystal chandeliers hung above the polished floor, their prisms scattering light into 1,000 delicate sparks. Music floated through the vast room, violins, a piano, the soft hush of conversation broken now and then by high laughter or the sharp pop of champagne corks. The scent was a heady blend of perfume, gardenia corsages, beeswax polish, and money. Margaret stood at the edge of it all, near a marble pillar, dressed in modest midnight blue satin, borrowed gloves slightly too loose at the fingers. Madame Delacourt had sent 2 girls from the shop to assist with last-minute hems, loose buttons, and fallen stitches. They were not guests. They were staff. But no one could tell by looking at Margaret. She carried herself like she belonged there. And then she saw her. Veronica Whitmore. Descending the grand staircase like a queen returning to court, her pale blonde hair twisted into perfect waves, her diamond earrings catching the light with every turn of her head. But it wasn't the jewels that made the room fall silent. It was the dress. The gown Margaret had sewn with aching fingers late into the night, fitting the bodice 3 times over to perfection, its silk cut in deep crimson, a color not often dared, too bold for most, but Veronica wore it like armor. The neckline swept low but elegant, the skirt full, sweeping behind her in careful pleats that rippled like wine poured slow into a crystal glass. Along the waistline, a narrow band of tiny hand-embroidered roses, Margaret's own idea, though Madame had taken the credit. It was a masterpiece. And it wasn't hers. Veronica floated across the marble like a woman untouchable. Nicholas Scott stood waiting for her near the center of the room, black tie sharp, his smile tailored to match his suit. His eyes, those same grey-green eyes, flickered briefly toward Margaret before returning, dutifully, to Veronica. Their worlds might as well have been divided by oceans. But Margaret didn't lower her gaze. Not this time. Let them dance. Let them spin in circles of privilege and performance. Margaret straightened her shoulders. They don't even know the name of the girl who made that dress. But I do. And one day, the signature inside the collar wouldn't be Delacourt's. It would be hers. For now, she was just a girl by a marble pillar. But she wore midnight blue satin like a queen wears armor. And she was not ashamed. A soft hush settled near the edge of the dance floor, like a shift in the wind before a storm. Margaret felt it before she saw them approach. Nicholas was leading Veronica toward her, not by intention, perhaps, but by accident or fate, or maybe simply the design of a crowded ballroom where circles overlap. Veronica's gloved hand rested lightly on Nicholas's forearm, her posture impeccable, and the scarlet silk of her gown trailing behind her like a whispered dare. When they reached Margaret's quiet corner, Veronica paused. Her gaze flickered over Margaret's figure, not hostile, not exactly curious either. More like a glance one gives to a piece of furniture unexpectedly in the wrong place. "Oh," Veronica said lightly, offering a porcelain smile. "You're one of Madame Delacourt's girls, aren't you?" Margaret's throat tightened for just a moment, But her voice, when it came, was steady. Yes. Veronica's eyes dropped, examining Margaret's modest gown, the slightly frayed gloves, the faint red marks on her fingertips invisible to most, but not to another woman accustomed to fine needlework. "Well," Veronica said with a sweet sharpness, "you've done beautifully. The fit is exquisite. Isn't it, darling?" She tilted her head to Nicholas. For a second, just a second, Nicholas looked directly at Margaret. No polite smile now. Something older sat in his expression, something unfinished. "It is," he said quietly. "It's perfect." Margaret met his gaze without flinching, without apology, though something inside her seemed to pull tighter, like thread caught in a too small needle's eye. "Thank you," she replied, calm, cool, utterly composed. "We take great care with every stitch." Veronica gave a delicate laugh, soft and brittle like spun sugar. "I suppose someone must." For a moment, they were three people standing on the thin thread of what might have been, or what would never be. The weight of silk, the sharpness of memory, the quiet pride of invisible labor pressed between them like the layers of a hidden seam. And then, just as quickly, Veronica guided Nicholas away with a possessive sweep of her hand, the crimson gown catching the candlelight one last time. Margaret remained by the marble pillar, chin lifted, eyes steady. Let them go. She knew what they didn't. The most beautiful parts of any garment are the stitches no one sees. And no one stitched like her. It wasn't long before the music shifted, the violins swelling into something softer, something made for dancing close. The crowd thickened, laughter rising like bubbles in champagne. Margaret was already edging her way toward the side doors, where the garden waited beyond, cool and dark, promising escape. "Margaret." His voice. Soft. Hesitant. Not the polished tones he'd used in introductions, or the cold politeness of earlier. Her name, spoken like a memory pulled from a drawer after too many years. She turned. Nicholas stood just behind her now, separate from Veronica, his tie slightly loosened, his expression unreadable, except for his eyes. They were the same storm grey as always, but tonight there was something else in them. Regret, perhaps. Or curiosity. Or maybe just unfinished sentences never spoken when it mattered. "I thought," he began, but stopped. Margaret waited, perfectly still. Let him be uncomfortable now. "I didn't know you worked for Delacourt," he said finally, softer, more real. "I didn't expect to see me here." Her voice was calm, almost kind, but with something steely underneath. "Or didn't expect me to be the one who made her beautiful." That hit something. His jaw shifted, just slightly, a muscle tightening. "It's not like that," he said quickly, but even he didn't sound convinced. Before another word could fall between them, Veronica appeared at his side again, her smile sharpened like the tip of a perfectly polished nail. "Darling," she purred, looping her arm through his, "there you are. Honestly, you do wonder." She barely glanced at Margaret this time, as if Margaret were a door someone had accidentally left open. "Come," Veronica said to him with a tilt of her flawless chin, "they're playing your song." Nicholas hesitated. Just for a breath. But then, he followed. Margaret stood alone again, the sounds of laughter and music pressing around her, the echo of her own name on his lips still lingering in the air like the aftertaste of something sweet that turns bitter the longer it stays. She didn't cry. Not here. Not for him. Instead, she adjusted her gloves, turned on her heel, and walked toward the open garden doors. The stars outside didn't care who danced inside, or who wore which gown, or who once loved whom. Out here, there was only cool air, quiet roses, and the steady beat of her own heart. That was enough. For now.